I have a picture. I'm smiling right by the plane. But the plane starts to taxi, and my parents are outside. And all of a sudden, it's like, wait, could we get off? Wait a minute, I don't think this is such a good idea. So the grief was first, and profound grief. And then you start to realize it's not going to change. You can't undo what happened. Then you move into the detachment because that's the only way to survive.
This is Safe Passage, where we invite you to explore the internal journey of transformation and change.
Whether it's relocation or retirement, the birth of a child or the loss of a loved one, life invites us, sometimes forces us to evolve.
So where do you turn when you feel stuck or unsure of what's next? I'm Doug Ota.
And I'm Nikki Muller. Welcome to Safe Passage.
So our first guest on the Safe Passage podcast is a woman who describes herself as a person in process. Someone whose life is a continuous interplay between the inner life and what's going on the outside, the journey on the outside. She grew up the daughter of American missionaries in Africa in the 1940s and 50s, before sociologist Ruth Usim had even coined the term third culture to describe the interstitial space people felt they occupied when they knew two or more cultures and ways of life deeply without feeling total belonging in any one of them. In other words, Ruth Van Reken was one of the original third culture kids before she, together with David Pollack, had even named the term. Ruth's lived experience and research about the often paradoxical nature of growing up globally has been a rich source of guidance, insight, and validation for millions of people across the globe. How many of us have had our aha moment because of Ruth and David's book, and now Ruth and David and Michael's book? She has been absolutely foundational in developing the language and conversation around transitions. Ruth, we are so glad you're here.
I'm thrilled to be here because you know that our life has interwoven on these topics through many ways, and it's a privilege to be with you both.
And the privilege is completely ours. And I just want to highlight once more that this book of yours, Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds, this is its fourth edition, right, Ruth? And it's been called the Bible for anyone who wants to understand the blessings and the curses of glowing up. I should say that word, glowing up and growing up multiculturally. And I read it first, Ruth, in 2020, and that was the beginning of a really huge internal shift for me, as I know it's been for many. It led me to research the TCK experience in depth. It helped me to understand the decades of unsupported transitions that I experienced since I was just 2 weeks old when I had my first move. And it fueled me to do a big thing, and that is to pivot careers and really focus the next chapter of my life on highlighting the transition conversations, because society is so obsessed with change that sometimes transition doesn't get the gravitas that it deserves. But most importantly, this work of yours, Ruth, actually led me to SPAN, Safe Passage Across Networks, which of course is the organization founded here by my co-host, Dr. Doug Ota. So it's a bit full circle for everyone in this moment. And what a brilliant way to start our first ever guest on our podcast, right, Doc Doug?
Can I say something about that? This is indeed the first other person we've had. And we could not, both of us, think of a better person to both do that with in both directions. Ruth, not only to hear from you and talk with you, but also for the very first time to try to tango with a third. Because we've done a bunch of tangos in our first episode. So this is the first time we're inviting somebody else to this transitions discussion dance that Nikki and I have been up to for a while.
So this is a transition in essence as well for us. So thank you, Ruth, for holding space as well. And we can't wait to dig in. Yeah.
And if I kick either of you in the shins accidentally and get my timing wrong, it's okay. We'll just notice. It's the first time.
I'm imagining us with a cup of coffee and a napkin in front of us where Doug is doodling, because that's how all of our first interactions started, with discussions and Doug doodling on a napkin. I will say one thing about the TCK book. You're holding up the third edition.
Yes, this is the last edition.
The fourth edition will be coming out in October, and we've added one more author, Cynthia Green. So just to make that clear.
That is brilliant. I'm so much looking forward to that. Cynthia Green has come into the fold here. Fabulous.
she's bringing she grew up in the corporate, so it's bringing, and she's a historian, so it's going to be interesting addition.
Love that. Thank you for that. I think, when we were preparing for this, Ruth, we wanted to see how do we explore this incredible, rich life that you have had and the lessons you've learned and the work that's come out of it and the larger transition conversation. So yesterday, Doug and I were talking about movements, right? In music, perhaps going through movements in this conversation. And we want to begin with your story because it's so embedded in the history of the TCK experience. So you were part of the internationally mobile missionary community at a time when the whole TCK research was still in its infancy. So if I were to ask you to describe your most vivid memory of your childhood neighborhood in Kano, Nigeria, what comes to mind?
The first thing that came to mind were trees. I loved my trees because in Kano, we could climb them. And there was always the challenge of figuring out if you could make the next branch. But also, it was a place that was creative. We could play house. Every branch was a different room. And you could also just be up there chatting with your neighbors, but you could hide there. If you climbed high enough when you played hide and seek, nobody ever looked up to see you. So that was just, somehow the trees were a huge part of my life. And I was also thinking one other thing that was always exciting was at Christmas, people would send a package from the States. If they had double bubble gum in it, then we were happy. That was the big, all right, we made it here. But as far as the environment went, we lived, for me, it was a normal life. We lived in houses, that were shared, and not the house was shared, but on what would be a compound, probably people would say, but it didn't have gates around it at that point. There was a eye hospital there, which people from all over Africa came to. There was a dispensary. There were guest houses. And the thing that probably, though, when I think about my childhood, the whole environment was that sense of home. You go to sleep, you're listening to the drums in the village, and you wake up in the call to prayers there at 5 a.m. And there were all these things that just made it home, especially if you could go to sleep in the rain, which wasn't so often, but when it was on the tin roof, And those are all the things that I think just made life cozy for me. I mean, it was, I know people think of their backgrounds as being idyllic, but for me, that environment was home. And it was safe, and it was where I belonged at that point.
So that makes me feel like asking you when the first sense of change or disruption was, Ruth, because what I hadn't expected there in your story were the sounds. It's so full of sounds. And
yes,
I don't mean to lead the witness, you answering the question, but I'm just wondering, what was that earliest sense that something's different?
Well, in terms of the sounds, they continued for probably most of my childhood there. But when you asked what was that first disruption, it was actually before I went to boarding school at 6. Now, boarding school was a total disruption. I'll talk about that in a minute. But there were, little kids idealize any adult that's kind to them, I think. And Mrs. Shield was so kind to me. She was such a sweetheart. And her husband had come to this eye hospital that was on our compound. And I forgot to tell you, I used to get to go to watch eye surgery, and I'd go to the dispensary, and they just let me walk.
And as a child, you got to watch surgery.
I watched cataracts. I watched enucleations. I watched all kinds of stuff because I was going to be a doctor, and that was the thing. That was my life goal. And so, in fact, when I said I wanted to be a nurse, people said, "No, why don't you be a doctor?" And I thought, well, that's a great idea. Then I took chemistry in high school, and I thought, well, it's not such a great idea. But Mrs. Shield was just so sweet to me. And our regular doctor, turns out, was going to come back from leave. And so I found out that Mrs. Shield was going to move to Ethiopia. I was crushed. I was absolutely crushed. And I'm like about 5. And in those days, we would all go to the airport to say goodbye to people. We didn't have any raft yet, but we were doing it, I think. And so we all got up. It's the middle of the night. And I prayed and prayed and prayed she wouldn't leave. And the airplane never came. So that was just wonderful. I thought, oh, God heard my prayer. This is great. And so now I had power as well, So we went home, and the next night they were supposed to go, and my mom wouldn't let me go 2 nights in a row because it was midnight. And I wasn't worried. And then I woke up in the morning and found out they were gone. And I was, my first great crisis of faith too. But it was like, how could this be? And then I never saw her again in the rest of my life. I met her daughter once at a conference, and I said, I still remember you guys and your family there. But the next year, I took that airplane ride, which we used to take on our little, one propeller jobs to go to boarding school. And Doug, I know you talk a lot about attachment, detachment, but I was asked to do something about my story a couple of weeks ago. And I suddenly realized that's when detachment started for me, was the airplane ride. And that first day, you're all excited until you get on the airplane. And then you figure out, oh, wait a minute, this isn't exactly like it was supposed to be. So that was my beginning. And actually, as I traced it recently, I thought that's sort of the story of my life, fighting against detachment.
Are you saying that you were feeling the detachment already as you boarded that plane, or is that something you look back at and notice started to develop over the course of the days and the weeks after that?
I think that one of the things that I realized later on when I was starting to look at my story was what Bowlby says about grief, despair, and detachment. And when I first looked at my story, it was through the lens of grief, because I had never dared to look at it with all this wonderful stuff. And I truly loved my childhood. So how could there be grief? But when I was thinking about it, I thought that's how it starts. It starts in grief. What I remember was being excited. I have a picture, I'm smiling right by the plane. But the plane starts to taxi, and my parents are outside. And all of a sudden it's like, wait, could we get off? Wait a minute, I don't think this is such a good idea. So the grief was first, and profound grief. And then you start to realize it's not going to change. You can't undo what happened. And so then you move into the detachment, because that's the only way to survive. And when you are 6 and you're not going to see your parents for 3 months, that's a long time.
No, I was just going to say, thank you for sharing that with us. And I can hear in your voice and I can see in your eyes that looking back at that moment as a 6-year-old feels almost as real today, perhaps, as it did then, despite or in spite of all the work that we do around transitions and all the understanding we have around it. It is something that we carry with us and becomes a part of our story. And I wanted to thank you for that, because one of the lines in your book that really made me well up was when you described your life as a continuous meal of loss. I was on a plane when I read that. I mean, why on earth I decided to open your book on a plane ride, which really symbolizes transience and disruption. When I read Continuous Meal of Loss, it was the first time I had felt seen, and I'm sure you've heard this over and over again. Do you still see your life in that way?
As a continuous meal of loss? I think by doing the work I've done within myself and through the journaling and all these things and through all these there was a place that I had to make a decision. Would I live fully in each moment, or would I keep trying to protect against the loss? Because that's what the detachment has done for me, that like I said, I have to still fight against it. But I think that my father, who was also a TCK but had no idea about that, always said to me, Ruth, wherever you go, unpack your bag and plant your trees. And he said so many people never live fully because they keep waiting to move and they keep trying to protect. So, I've done a lot of conference work in the last few years since I've done all this. And I realize each time I can go to my room and hide, or I can get to know the people. I can hear their stories. And each time I do, my life is enriched. And I always feel sad at the end of the conference that I'm not going to see a lot of these people again. But in the moments that we interact, I gain, and I hope they gain. And so I think there was a point that I remember very distinctly when I was saying, I wasn't opening any mail from my friends that I had just left. And I thought, why is that? And I started to cry, and I thought, don't I ever get to keep my friends? And I thought, maybe not, but I can, if this is the life I've been given of being in a way transient, not just, in my childhood, but in my adulthood, how do I live it fully? And so that's what I've tried to do.
You're describing a beautiful arc across life, Ruth, where it seems to me at first, and maybe you noticed this as you got into this work, I certainly did, people have a hard time accepting the difficult parts of this otherwise, in many ways, remarkable, lovely, incredible life full of opportunities when you get to see a lot of the world. And it's because we have a hard time holding opposites in ourselves. How can something so wonderful also be terrible?
And so hard, but they can exist in tandem. They can, and they do. Yeah.
And when you quoted this line of hers, Nikki, a continuous meal of loss, in some ways, I wonder if you think you wrote that at a time when your attention was swinging almost over more to the other extreme, because you land right in the middle now. It's a continuous meal of loss and wonderful gain, back and forth. Yeah.
I think for me, the reason I wound up with so much unresolved grief, which is, still maybe to be looked at, but as far as doing the journaling, was I didn't understand paradox. And it felt to me that if I would say anything was negative for me, I was discounting my life. And I didn't want to discount my life. And also in the environment I grew up in, the paradox of pain and faith, because I think the environment was such, if you had enough faith, you shouldn't feel the pain because you understand why. And a military kid can feel the same way, or any TCK. We understand why our parents are doing what they're doing, and they're mobile and we're moving back and forth. But if you can't do both, you're left with the choice of either or. So I've met so many people who only look at the positives, and they live with a lot of expressions of unresolved grief, just like I did. I had a lot of anger and depression that other people wouldn't see, but I felt it, and I didn't understand it. Or people live only in the pain, and they can't see anything good, and that's not helpful either. So paradox is the name of the game here.
In times of transition, especially as a child, when your inner world was in turmoil, you've written that you kept this to yourself most of the time because everyone else around you looked like they were managing okay on the surface. They were, some of them, experiencing the same change you were, but it didn't look like they were having trouble with these big feelings. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about your journaling that you've alluded to in the conversation so far, journaling those silent feelings that led you to publish your book, Letters Never Sent, in 1984.
Of course, the reason for the journaling is all the years before it. When I think back, and you think about that first time in boarding school and where you detach, and then back and forth between the States and my grandma, and, the whole mobility thing each time you detach. My parents went back to Nigeria when I was 14, and I never saw them for 4 years because there was no American high school there. And the idea was always that, I had to stay ready to continue in my educational system. So I had a great time with my aunt and my grandmother in high school. But again, although I cried like mad the night before they left, once they left, I pulled the curtain down and just became terribly happy in high school. And I had a great time in high school. So if you had asked me in high school and college how I was, I would have told you I was just fine. And when I see surveys, if people don't tell me what age people were when they're asking these questions, I think, I will question you a little bit on because I was fine, in my opinion, in all those early years. It was when I got out and I got married, and I found that it was difficult. I wanted to be close to David, but I was afraid like 100%, because then something bad will happen. You're going to lose him. So, if we get close, all of a sudden I'm fussing about the garbage. I didn't understand it at all. But I began to think, what's the matter here? Because it doesn't make sense to me. I don't have any reason for what I'm doing. And so life continued. And then I had my first really big depression when we went back to Africa. Dave was a medical student. So we went back and I had my first baby there, but we were trying to go to Nigeria and they wouldn't give me a visa. And I'm thinking, I'm born here and you won't give me a visa. So that was a rejection.
Big one.
And so we wound up in Liberia, but at Christmas we went back to Nigeria. I saw my house, I saw my school, the oranges were green, everything was the way it was supposed to be. And then we came back to the States and moved to St. Louis where I had a new baby. I had a husband who was on call every other night. I had no friends, and depression hit like I couldn't believe. I've never been depressed like that before in my life. I even understood why people tried to commit suicide because I thought, it just felt so hopeless. Talk about despair. And we had our second child there. We moved to the Navy and things got a bit better. And I thought I was, okay, I'm okay. And then we went to Liberia long term. And as you know, there were some difficulties in Liberia politically, and my husband was seconded to work for the government in their hospital and their medical school, and they closed him. So we were trying to figure out what to do. And bottom line, my daughter decided, her grandma said, why don't you come back to the States and you can start school here. You won't have to change in a few months when your parents come. That was a great idea, except I got all depressed again. I thought, okay, this is not reality in terms of why. And that's when I thought I was 39 and I thought there's something I've carried, through my life. So you're right, Doug, when I was writing, I thought, okay, she's leaving. I left at 6. It must connect. So I began to write Dear Mom and Dad. I wasn't writing a book. I was just journaling. And all of a sudden, I was the child in bed. People said, how did you remember? I said, no, I didn't remember. I was re-experiencing it. And now the adult me is trying to find words that the child had no words for. And suddenly I, couldn't suck my fingers because they were going to put socks on my fingers. I hurt. And, the fear. And I couldn't use my pillow because that would make me suck my fingers. And so all these things, you're 6 years old trying to figure out. But, the other thing when you think about identity, not just detachment, at 6, if we learn our identity from our family, from our community, from our place, at 6, all 3 of those changed for me. And I had to start all over again in trying to figure things out. So that was why at 39, I thought, okay, there's something. And the minute I started, that's when I realized that the very things I had loved, because I lost them, had created grief. And so you're exactly right. It was writing about the continuous losses that I had never looked at before. Some people said, you need to put happy stuff in the book. It's too depressing. And I tried for a little bit. And I thought, you know what? I'm just apologizing for the grief, which is what I did my whole life. So
Beautifully said.
And those questions are coming from other people's issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes.
And their experiences and not yours.
Their struggle with what you're touching upon, right? It's interesting also just because I never thought of what you just said I've heard you tell that story before, Ruth, at age 6, but never the idea of, it was your family, your place, and what else?
And the community around you. So these identity anchors, right? Identity anchors change.
And you had carried this Western definition of identity, which tends to be sort of me specific. I'm a sort of self-contained thing, and I'm not determined and defined by the people around me. The example I always use is I forget that I'm a psychologist at the end of a vacation. I'm like, how do you do that? And I sit with my clients and they teach me. It's like, oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do here. And you went off and you probably also, maybe nobody ever necessarily talked about identity. Maybe they did. But all of a sudden yours was gone because of all of those determining factors.
Right, because when you're in your family, the rules of your family. When you're in a boarding school, all the rules change because the boarding school is an orphan experience for anybody who's done it because you don't have any adult just for you. And so you're part of this sort of massive humanity. And I realized in my journaling and later that the part of the safety was to try and stay visible. For me, I know teacher, so that if I ever got lost, somebody would come look for me. And, other kids retreat. But then you have your community, and my community was different, but the things we did in terms of our activities and all those things, I mean, I wasn't going to the hospital anymore to see operations, but that changed. But the place, also changed. And so those things are pretty significant when we're doing mobility as well, that we lose ourselves.
A patient of mine once talked about being sent away to boarding school at, I think, the age of 8, a little bit older than you were. And the sounds when kids would go to sleep, the sniffling and the sobbing that all the kids were trying to suppress because there was a tremendous sanctioning against any display of that because it reminded everybody of stuff they were trying to forget.
Absolutely.
And so they became hard with each other, right?
Yeah. My parents actually used to threaten me with boarding school when I was living in England. That was the last time that we were a family unit before my parents divorced. But of course you don't understand that at 6 or 7 years old, why they're taking you to see this school when you're very aware that this is where students sleep through every week and for several months. And they showed me the bunk beds, they showed me the bathrooms and the stalls. And I'm an only child, so seeing several sinks and several beds and several everything else was so overwhelming. And they kind of looked at me and they said, so unless you want to go here, you're going to follow the rules, you're going to be a good girl, right? And I just said, I will do everything that it takes so that I don't get sent to boarding school. Yeah, I haven't thought about that since you both brought up your own stories around it. So,
and that's, that's jabbing the attachment system right there, because you're activating the fear that's biological of abandonment. And we will do anything to avoid that.
Yes,
right?
And to ensure that we're safe.
I'm wondering if now's a good time, Ruth. Could we invite you to maybe turn to this? I want to emphasize that it's not your book. It's one of your books.
One of your books.
To the audience.
It's the first publication.
This was the first one that you published, 1984, I believe. Would you be willing to read maybe the first letter? The first entry?
The first entry was your first grader, right?
This is what came out when I was journaling at 39. But this is when I was trying to describe what was happening in my body and in my tears. And I did make a commitment when I started journaling that I would not stop my tears this time. And if I started to cry, that I would cry until I finished. Sometimes I thought I'd never finish. This is September 1951. Dear Mom and Dad, I feel awful. Something inside is squeezing me so bad I can hardly breathe. You said it would be fun to get on the plane and go to boarding school, but so far it isn't. I couldn't stop crying on the airplane, but I didn't want the other kids to know, because to be a crybaby was the biggest shame of all. I kept my face to the window so they might think I liked watching the clouds. When I got to school this afternoon, I was still crying, and I just couldn't stop. The missionary aunties who met us said I should be more like Maybeth. Try to be big and brave like your sister, they said. She's not crying. They don't know that Maybeth never cries. Not even when Spotty got run over by the car or our pet bird died. How can I be like her? And how can I live without you? It feels like my heart got pulled out of me today. Love, Ruth Ellen. That was my name then. And when my sister read that, it really hit her. I was surprised, but it just hit her that she said, I think I stopped crying before, because she was born on the way to Africa with my parents, the first time in Portugal. And so she had a lot of mobility from the moment of her birth. And, I don't know what all happened, but there was another time Dave Pollock was on a radio program and they were questioning boarding schools, because a lot of people really, do have different opinions about it. And the psychologist who was interviewing him, he said, well, some people do fine. Look, her sister was fine. I thought, how'd you miss that? But anyway, it's actually not fine to be that age and not miss your parents.
And Ruth, one of the things I've heard you say before is when we look at the outside, what we're supposed to be like, our coping strategies just to stay afloat because we are so used to disruption. I'd love to hear more about what you said in one of your TED Talks, because you did say, actually, I was excited to move to the United States after my childhood in Nigeria because you had that passport, that American passport. You had family, close family that would be there to welcome you. But what you didn't know was that when the airplane door closed for takeoff, you lost your world. You said there was never a funeral for it. Could you tell us a little bit more about the complexities of that experience, this re-entry, the hidden immigrant experience, losing your world and being thrust in another and not knowing the rules?
Yes, I think that was probably one of the biggest things. You know, you're excited, just like I was excited about going to boarding school until it happens, because you don't know what you don't know. And so when I was doing the journaling and I came close to writing about leaving Nigeria, I basically put it aside. I thought, this is silly. I don't know what I'm doing. This is dumb. But I was avoiding the reality. Once I started to journal about that moment, that's when I cried like, you know, somebody had died. And I realized that was the day my world died, because all those sights, all those smells, all those sounds were gone. They were just gone. And so there was no funeral. We had no place, which is why what the work you're doing is so important. But I want to read one other poem that we've had in each of the TCK books, because when I read it first, it's called Mock Funeral by Alex Graham James, who was TCK. There was no funeral, no flowers, no ceremony. No one had died, no weeping or wailing. Just in my heart, I can't. But I did anyway, and nobody knew I couldn't. I didn't want to, but nobody else said they didn't. So I put down my panic and picked up my luggage and got on the plane. There was no funeral. And I think that's what the work of SPAN is about, giving that opportunity to say the goodbye so that you can move on. And in a sense, to make a funeral, to have a funeral, so that we can acknowledge what was and then move to what is. But when I got to the States, thinking I'm going home, because of course that'd been what my mother called, and I went to the same elementary school she did.
That was in Chicago, right?
In Chicago. It was the worst year of my life because I looked like everybody else. It was pre-integration days. People looked at me, I looked at them. They assumed I knew what they knew, and I assumed that I should know what they know. And I knew nothing. I didn't know the singers. I talked about Elvis. I said, who's he? We went on a outing once. I had 50 cents in my pocket, and so they didn't go to McDonald's. They went someplace else. I ordered a hamburger, and I totally forgot that there was tax. And so when the bill came, I couldn't pay it, which was so embarrassing. And I had to go ask my uncle, who was one of the chaperones, if, he could give me 2 cents. I promised to pay you back. And of course, 2 cents. And then I thought, shh, don't let people know I'm asking you. Because how can you, for everybody else, how can you not remember there was tax? Well, where I grew up, you bargained people down. You didn't bargain people up. And so I didn't know how to ice skate. I didn't know how to swim. I didn't know how to do anything. It never occurred to me at that point they didn't know how to play soccer, because I used to play soccer every afternoon when, my parents' friends got out of school. I think I forgot to tell you that after the boarding school, I was homeschooled for 4 years. And those were the good years where I loved being in Kano, because I forgot to say that. But anyway, it was absolutely awful. And everything I thought about myself, that I was social, that people liked me. I knew people were making fun of me. because I was such an idiot. And unfortunately, there was another girl who had just come from the Congo, a class behind me, and I watched them mock her. We didn't have the right clothes. We didn't have the right slang. We didn't have the right anything. And I started to hate going to school every day because it was so painful to know people are laughing at you behind your back, but they did it like they'd ask questions, and then, they're tittering with, your silly answer. So that was not a good year. And that's why I decided when I went to high school, I will never tell anybody I'm from Africa.
Yeah.
But
So,
because when I first got there, they'd say, "Where are you from?" I'd say Nigeria. Well, that didn't go too well. So I cut that part of myself off.
so that segues into something that you've just it segues into our last question from this first movement.
Yes.
But you referred to going back to Africa with David as newly married and wanting to go to Nigeria, but ironically not being able to. But we're wondering sort of that secret got buried in you that you really were Nigerian. You just had to put it away. And can you talk about how that secret got to be too big to carry, if we're inferring correctly? Because then one of your first postings you ever want to go to is Nigeria with your new husband. Can you connect those wires for us?
Yes, I think, there's a difference between what you consciously don't tell people and maybe then what is still within you. But all of my life, as I said before, I wanted to do medical work in Africa, when I grew up. And so I had become a nurse, even though I didn't become a doctor. And that was still there. And there was a part of me at some point had to decide, what if I had to stay in America? Maybe it was that feeling of going home. I don't know, that down deep inside, I had fit in high school and I thought everything was quite fine. But still, that had always been from my childhood on, that one day I would come out here, and I used to go out to the villages and be with medical teams and stuff. So when I would date people and I'd say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" They wanted to be some businessman or whatever they wanted to be. And when I asked David, he said, "I want to be a doctor in Nigeria." I thought, you got it.
You are the man of my dreams.
There are not many of you. We're going to take this one seriously. Because so when I asked him why, when he was a child, well, he had gone to China as a child with his parents for 2 years until the political thing changed there. So he had the similar background. But there was a doctor from their church that worked in Nigeria. And because David's father was a doctor, whenever he came back to the States, the Van Rekens always were asked to host them. And so he grew up hearing all the stories. So he read about David Livingston and, all that stuff. So before we ever married, we both had that same goal. And so then when David was a medical student, they gave them, they could take electives. And so that was when we applied for a fellowship to do an elective in Africa. And that's how we got there the first time. But then we went back long-term for 9 years to Liberia since we had made that transition. And so we lived there for 9 years.
You
later.
seem to be suggesting, Ruth, given the timing and your use of the age of 39 when you actually finally sat down to write your first book, Letters Never Sent, you seem to be suggesting that almost going back to Nigeria, needing to get back to Africa, in some ways was almost like a salmon swimming upstream. You weren't necessarily aware completely of why you were doing it, why you felt this compulsion. It was just necessary. But you weren't aware that you were reconnecting necessarily in a conscious way with roots that you had to cut yourself from.
I was just going to say, for many people, one of the things that Dave Pollock used to suggest in transitions was a journey of clarification, that it's sometimes important to go back on a conscious way, because you're exactly right. It wasn't conscious, but as soon as I got off the plane, I was home. And it smelled right.
And yeah, it all rushes back, right? All the senses are heightened and it brings you back. And listening to you just now, Ruth, telling us about this, I'm remembered of the TCK experience that you write about, how we tend to self-edit, right? Which is what you did with your big secret that you decided to keep in high school. You didn't tell anyone you had been to Africa, even though your heart was in Africa. So we will edit parts of ourselves and what we share with others based on whether or not it might be palatable in that moment, because we don't want to feel othered or excluded. So and then comes David, who I suppose must have been a good-looking man, but here is someone who saw you and wanted to connect with your world that you had kept from so many people for so long. That is so beautiful. That kismet, kismet who saw you and wanted to do that. And I think now is a good time, Doug, to move into our second movement, because Ruth has just mentioned David Pollock as well. And I think we're getting into the work, getting into the research of Ruth's journey and others. Yes, please.
Could I do that? I have a great idea for this.
Yeah, do it.
Throughout our first movement, we've heard this bing. There's been like these notifications coming in, and I think that might be somebody's telephone. Ruth, is that your telephone?
I keep trying to turn it off.
But it tells me you're a very popular woman. No one ever texts me that much.
Ruth is. It shows.
I forgot to do that, and I didn't surreptitiously trying to hit the right button.
It
but
shows us
apparently
how lucky we are to have you on here. But it also marks your story. It's like a Tinkerbell through your whole story.
That's true.
And that's the sound. That is the sound, ladies and gentlemen, of movement number 1. And Doug Ota, conductor, is now going to move us to movement 2.
Yes, because that was the triangle we heard.
Your research and your journey into really the theoretical part of trying to get at what this was all about. You want to pose our first question, Nikki? You were just about to. I interrupted
I was just about to. No, but I loved that because the ping of the cell phone was very much like the bing of a triangle. No, I think it all really works with the movement that Doug was talking about. But yeah, when, the letters never sent, these entries, what I loved about this was it spanned all the way from your experiences and your memories from 1951 all the way till 1984, when you watched your own child, Sherry, walk alone on that tarmac and leave your family in Liberia for high school in the United States. And you said that the biggest lesson that you learned whilst you were journaling these letters in the years since is not to fear the process of exploring the deeper places of your life. And I think the greatest gift of your willingness to do so is publishing your book initially with David Pollock, which is this beautiful balance of research and real life stories collected from across the globe. So I'm curious about how you both came together to do some of the most rigorous research of the TCK experience to date. What was that catalyst? Walk us through that moment.
Well, it has to go back probably to where I met Dave. So I'm in the middle of Liberia, middle of my journaling, and I got an invitation to fill out a survey for our children, what we thought about their educational process. And I found out there was going to be this international conference on missionary kids in Manila, which was the first one, and Dave Pollock was organizing it. And interestingly enough, at that point, he was not allowed to do anything except education because they told him the kids were just fine. And so people weren't going to support it if it was, all this fuzzy stuff. But anyhow, so I filled it out for my kids, and then I got mad. And I wrote Dave, and I said, I'm 39. I'm trying to figure out my life. Nobody ever did a conference for me. All the stuff I see you're talking about, I said, never heard a word about it. Didn't know I was a TCK. And so if you want to know what it was like for one person reflecting back, I said, maybe I'm the only one, but I will send you what I'm journaling, and maybe it'll help your conference. That was kind of nasty, but I was mad. And so he, of course, wrote back and said, no. And I have all these letters. He said, I don't, you're not the only one. And he sent me back a letter from a therapist. He had asked, what were the things that MKs missed the most, or was the biggest problem? And she said that they didn't know what it meant to be a person. So we're talking about identity. And also they didn't have comfort. And when I saw the word comfort, I just began to cry and cry because I really didn't know what I was writing about. I just kept writing these feelings. And I thought, that's the point. I had all these feelings, but there was no comfort. And because people were trying to, help me through it. But I also, then I think as I looked at my story, I began to understand it was grief. And that probably was the piece that I brought. Dave was looking at a lot of the he had worked overseas with TCKs. He wasn't a TCK. So the gift he gave was he could observe because it wasn't internal. For those of us who had done it, we just thought, it's just my story. I'm this, misfit. But I had, in my nursing, I had been sent to a seminar by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did the whole work on death and dying and the grief cycle. And so as I began to look at my own story and I thought about my anger and my anxiety and all these different things, I realized that I was repeating her cycle. So I kind of brought that and we talked about that. And then, long story short, I went to the conference. That was when I think I put the curtain up and said, okay, it's not that I still am. This experience is part of me now. And Dave and I would talk, and with Norma McKay, who started Global Nomads, and even Ruth Useem. I came back from that conference in Manila, and Ruth Useem happened to be in Liberia that night. So I had this grand conversation with her. So we would have these conversations and talk, and Dave was going around the world explaining his TCK profile and the transition experience because he's the person who developed that first. And it started to get into I see things in New York Times or something, and I said to Dave, if you need to write your stuff, because if you don't write it, you're going to be copying the people who are copying you because they're really just saying what you're saying, but making an article. And he said, I don't have time. And I said, well, I'll help you, because I thought, how hard could this be? He's got the whole profile. He's got the whole thing. No problem. So I had gone back to Alzheimer nursing at that point because there was a lot of rejection from the first book when people didn't know why I was so negative. And so I took a 3-month leave of absence. I figured, I could do it in 3 months. And when we sent it into the publishers, no publisher would look at it except Intercultural Press because they thought of it as an academic topic because they knew Ruth Useem. And when I sent it in, the guy wrote back very nicely. He said, you can't just describe it. He said, you have to explain it. I thought, well, I don't know why. It just happened. And so that became a 6-year journey of trying to listen to people and listen. And I'm a but why lady. And I think, Dave had done the description. Of course, he was also looking at but why. But that's where my internal sense of listening to people, and that's where I think what I could bring was the experience. Dave could he could define it, he could see it. And then the question is, but why does this happen? And so that's been the process ever since, having a mental puzzle and trying to put the pieces together and, why? And when I was a child, they always called me the question box, the why auntie. And it was not a blessing at that point because I think it annoyed people terribly, but it turned out to be my gift. So that's how it started. And then, of course, the last email I ever wrote Dave was, we need to make a second edition. But the process, you asked about the process. I took his material and I tried to write. And at first I tried to write like I was Dave. And the editor, then I was writing the other stuff. He said, you've got 2 voices. And I thought, how could we have 2 voices? I wrote it all. But I thought, and then I would send it to him, of course, and he would, make his comments and so forth. But I realized when I was trying to be Dave, I had one voice. And then when I was writing some other things, and so I can't explain the process, but having to take it inside and redo it. And we had some great editors. So that's how it started.
There's so many beautiful stories from people all around the world that really help to highlight a lot of the research, which is why I think this book is so well balanced, is we can feel it, we can resonate with other people's experiences, and they're of all ages, all demographics, and then you back it up with the data. How did you go about meeting all these people and hearing all these stories? Because that's a journey in and of itself.
Well, you go to enough conferences, and of course, people were writing me from the Letters Never Sent book because nobody would publish that one either at the beginning. So it was my address on the book, and everybody was calling to order a book, and then they tell me their story. Dave Pollock was going around the world doing conferences, and everybody would tell him their story. The big knock that people had was, you don't have any facts and figures. And I thought, well, so a lot of people didn't believe it was actually a phenomenon. And so finally, I thought, well, maybe I don't have figures, but I know that everybody I talk to has the same story. Somebody gave me a word once. He said, "You're a heuristic researcher." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "You listen to stories and you draw conclusions, and then one day the other researchers will have to do the facts and figures." And I thought, okay. And that's kind of where we are now. But I'm not afraid of the research because I think it'll grow things, but the bottom line issues of identity and loss seem to be themes and detachment. So that's how it started. And it worked for who I was because I'm not so organized, so I didn't have to do all these analytics like Doug had to do for his work.
There's something that David, I would hear him present about, and you're talking about it in your story as well. I think you guys called it an inflection point, something that would happen around somebody's 30s often. And I think he also called it a delayed adolescence, where all of a sudden some of these things that had to get parked because you were in a dependent position, you were being moved around and you couldn't necessarily rebel because you had no other supports except mom and dad, that a lot of those things would only come to surface at or after university even. Can you speak to that a little bit in terms of a sort of a subset of what you were noticing in people's stories, maybe your own story?
I could almost tell within 5 years how old people were when they called me. And they started to tell me their story. Because younger people, like I say, generally are fine in a certain sense. But I think for a lot, it was like me, that you get out of school, you have this image of how wonderful you are and how you're going to do everything right. And suddenly you're not being who you wanted to be. And other people did what I did, that suddenly you get mad at your parents. It's their fault. It's somebody's fault. It's your roommate's fault. It's got to be somebody's fault that you're not such a perfect person. And then finally you get enough changes in your environment and you're still being who you are. And you get tired of being mad. You get tired of blaming. And you start to think, what is this about me? And I think that starts to come for a lot of people. But I can't tell you how many people between 35 and 45 are really doing that kind of work. And probably maybe it's, in any background, I don't know. You're a psychologist, Doug, you can say. But I think for a lot of us, you sort of outlive your excuses for why you're feeling what you're feeling. And Nikki, you can say, you also came to it later in life. So
exactly. 36 is when I picked up your book and did the deep dive. So you were right on the money with that. And also, if we're looking at that's sort of the beginning of midlife, or right at that cusp, and that's a developmental transition, right? These are milestones in our lives, in which are also inflection points where we start to look at, well, we go retroactively look at what has made us, what are things that I have not faced yet, why do I have a gnawing feeling inside me that I cannot explain. For me, I had described it as a gray shadow that had always been looming over me, but I couldn't see it clearly until that, as Doug said earlier, the aha moment that yours and Dave's book gave me. And I think that it's so interesting that it's that specific life stage that we tend to look back, and you're right, you start to realize, I can't run away from this. Maybe I should lean in and not do what I usually do, the modus operandi of turning away or running away when something is hard.
I've got a particular spin on this too, because I think it's true for all young people across the board anyway. It's just more pronounced and even extreme with TCKs, with people who've led this life. It reminds me of those old cartoons that I certainly grew up with, the Looney Tunes, where I think Coyote would run off the cliff and he was going so fast he wouldn't realize yet that he was not on any hard surface, and only later would he fall.
I remember that, of course.
And that's sort of the picture I have of the TCK version of being a teenager. My old colleague Dick Bauman used to talk about, you can't do therapy with a teenager. Now, I don't necessarily completely agree with that, but what he was onto, I think, is that when you're in a dependent position, you can't yet afford to look at, so is this actually solid, sensible ground I'm standing on? It's kind of risky, and it could even, in many family situations, be sanctioned or even punished. So it's often only when kids would get to university or maybe even into their early 20s. And my experience with TCKs, with kids who've gone to international schools, led this, on paper, rather glamorous life and are sort of seen by their peers as having led glamorous, glitterati lives. There's this sense of being coyote, like, well, everything has to be great then. And that can go on longer. I don't know if you agree with this, Ruth, before they kind of go, what really did happen?
Sure. I think another reason we do it later is maybe it's safe. It's safer because I survived it. And when I started to go back and do the journaling, I had to kind of go back and pick up my little child, in a sense. At some point, I had to even go get a teddy bear. And even though the tears were falling, I, as the adult, could take care now of that child. And even though the tears are falling now, I know who I became. I know that we made it. And so I think that's why you don't need to be afraid, because you can afford to go back. And even recently, just really going back to my 8th grade self, and really realizing I've sort of ignored her for most of my life. But, just saying, there was a lot of shame for you, a lot of shame that you just didn't know what was the matter with you. And kind of going back and processing that within myself for the different times in my life. But because you've made it and you're living a different experience right now, at least for me, that was what gave it safety to go back and,
Ruth, I'd like
pray.
I'd like to say 2 things to you about that. First of all, thank you, because I learned again something from you, and your answer is better than mine. What I just learned from you that I think is closer to the truth is it takes longer to get strong enough in yourself to actually look at the volume of loss. You and David always wrote, it's more than most people, by the age of 18, more loss than most people ever experience in a lifetime. That you have to get strong enough in yourself to finally be ready and able to do that.
And I think that's why you don't need to be afraid. I would always tell my husband, I should make the point, my husband's name is David too,
Yes.
so it gets complicated. I was on a conference and they said I was married to David Pollock, and I thought, well, actually my husband might be surprised about that. But so
News to you.
it was news to him too. So, and to Dave Pollock and his wife. But I think that I would always say, Dave, I want you to tell me how you feel. And they said, but the minute I do, you get so defensive that I'd rather not. At some point in my journaling, I realized there was this teenage self that was protecting my 6-year-old. With her arms out, ain't nobody going to touch her. And that was part of the story too, was, okay, I'd like the 6-year-old to come out, but I can't make her. And, for me, it's an issue with prayer and stuff. But finally, she came out. She wasn't very happy. But that's when I had to go and pick up a teddy bear and realize I don't have to defend her anymore. She's part of me. She can be here and be received. And she doesn't have to stay over there all alone under this little table that I'd seen. I'd like to invite her to join me now. And that might sound weird to some people, but that's been sort of my process, is that we do leave parts of ourselves in different places. We have these cross-cultural experiences where we don't know the rules. And so whoever that was there doesn't work in a new place. It's not just mobility. The mobility can take us there. But when it's cross-cultural and you don't know the rules, then what do you do with that other part? And so part of doing the 4th edition was realizing it's a grief to lose yourself. It's not just that you don't have identity. It's actually a grief because that part of you loved and that part that was fun and that was, whatever, is gone. And you don't, what can you do with it? And that is actually its own grief. That's another loss that I hadn't really put words on until recently.
And little kids, you say some people might think that's a little, I don't know, what was the word you used? Fluffy?
Yeah, or it's silly, but maybe.
I actually explain to people how practical I think it is to think in those terms, because trees, onions, have earlier rings too. There's no such thing, I always explain, as a tree that just gets rid of its early rings. So we have those too. But if you had experiences that you didn't know what to do with, yeah, you have to put them away. And when you were talking about that inner child, which again, I think is a very practical way to think about it, that you've lost touch with, the trick you seem to be pointing at is if it's safe enough, and this is true from attachment theory, if it's safe enough and within yourself, if you've done enough work or you're committed to doing enough work to say, you come out when you're safe. I'm here. Kids who are forced to come out, they're just even more scared. And oftentimes, in my experience, just providing the safety, and you can do that within yourself with help, is what it takes to finally get to these places, which you're so beautifully modeling for people.
Now, I was just thinking, the other thing, though, is the reason you have to detach at some level is the enormity of the grief. And when I was journaling, the next place I stopped, and then I went back to eventually, was the night or the day my parents left for 4 years. And I was avoiding that. And, I did fine. I was with my grandma. I had a great time. You know what I mean? All that kind of stuff. But when I started to journal on it, honestly, I thought I'd never stop crying because I realized that was the day my family died. And it was as big as if the police just called me and said my parents were in a car wreck. Because I realized never again were we 6 children and 2 parents living as a family as we had done. But again, there's no funeral and nobody died. And so at 14, to survive it, you just pull the curtain. I mean, I literally, when they called me from New York and said, we're getting on the plane, the curtain went down. And I, okay, that's over. But to lift the curtain was important. But again, I just cried and cried and cried. And finally, it stopped. But I think maybe that also let me then, when my mother was older, and she lived with us her last 11 years. And so we had that time. But I don't know if I could have received her if I hadn't gone through the process of acknowledging how important my family was and in a way of receiving back who they were and who they were in my life.
Thank you for sharing that, Ruth. And I was wondering if we could stay with this story, because this is such a pivotal moment. This is such an important part of your life when you feel like your family died. It's the last time the unit was intact. And for 4 years, you went through a lot. And you talked earlier about working with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross to help you sort of provide theoretical framing for your transitions work. And I'm wondering, how does your transition cycle reflect her model for the stages of grief, the 5 stages of grief? If we were to look at this moment in your life, when you and your family were separated for that amount of time, how does that interplay and mesh with your transition cycle that you often go around the world speaking of? I just thought we could use an example.
Sure. Well, I think at that point I was in denial pretty much the 4 years. When I would feel sad, I would do something else. So that's where it was coming out then, of course, in anxiety labor. But a few years later, of course, Dave was the one who made the transition cycle regarding mobility. And so at first, they were 2 separate things. And, he says we're in involvements, and then we're in leaving, and we're in transit, and then we're in reentry or entry, and then we're in re-involvement. So I had them as 2 different models in my mind at some point. And there was a day that I was asked to do something for a conference, not on the kids, but a lot of people had lost relatives in the time they'd been whatever. And they asked me to talk about grief. So I went back to looking more specifically at the grief cycle. And I read someplace they said some people are using her grief cycle, Dr. Ross's grief cycle, for non-death experiences. And I thought, oh, it never occurred to me that because she did it about dying, that it couldn't be used for something else, because I had intuitively been using that. But that time when I was looking at that and looking at the mobility house, and I thought they're actually the same thing. I hate to say this, but the transition cycle in its own way, you start with involvement, maybe that you could say that was denial. But then when you go into the leaving, that goes into and the change and all these things. We go through the same kind of processes of the different, we withdraw, we get anxious, we get angry, we do all those things. And all of a sudden I thought, we're just talking about the same thing in different language in a certain sense. Now, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong on that, but then all of a sudden I thought, okay, this starts to make some sense about why transition is so important to me, because intuitively I did it this way. And actually I was living it, just not with that same language. That makes sense for you guys?
Very much so. And that's what I love about being in this work, relatively recent compared to both of you, because I start to see the similarities between different people and different schools of thought and different disciplines, and how actually the common experiences around transition is profound, whether we're talking about it with the death of a loved one, whether we're talking about a move, or whether we're talking about feeling like you're going to be left behind because of AI disruption and am I about to get laid off? There are so many beautiful confluences between different models, and it's great to be able to hear it from you, considering you had intuitively already felt this decades ago, that there was something in that, and that transition work was essential because it affected everybody regardless of what that transition was. So it does make sense 100% for me. For you, Doc?
Yeah, as I was listening to you, Ruth, I was just realizing I'd never thought about overlaying Bowlby's stages as the backdrop, the skeleton, the framework of Kubler-Ross's phases. He would talk about first a child protests, and then moves towards a stage of despair. And then there's a stage of detachment. And Kubler-Ross's model, as you of course know, has had all kinds of people seeing qualities in it and detractors from it. But it ends with acceptance, which often sounds so finished. And it sounds relatively positive too, in a way that anybody who's ever really, lost somebody that they really love, certainly a spouse, wonders if they'll ever reach. And as I listened to you, it also made me think that acceptance is just the face, possibly. There's all kinds of versions of what is it really underneath, because it could be detachment. It could be just behaving and getting on with it. And no, I'm not from Africa. I came from St. Louis, whatever, right? So, because denial and anger, that sounds like the beginning and middle of Bowlby's protest, the kid screaming that doesn't want to be left behind, and then bargaining and depression moving towards despair. And then acceptance could be acceptance, but it could be detachment, just letting go and cutting off from your feelings.
Sure. And then which we've spoken about before. And if we look at William Bridges' framework for transitions, he talks about how a transition begins with an ending and ends with a beginning. And it's that middle part, that neutral zone, that messy middle where our old identity doesn't fit anymore, but we haven't formed the new one, and we feel like we're stuck. We feel all sorts of anger, confusion. We can flip from feeling good today and tomorrow our world crashes all over again. There are so many parallels. It's interesting. It's fascinating that we're having this moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I love.
How about if I ask Ruth one more theoretical question, and then we'll move towards movement 3 and looking towards things beyond transitions and the future. But I guess we're wondering if you could speak to hidden losses in ways that maybe you feel you haven't already, the different kinds of hidden losses. And I'm gonna sandwich it with the question we had right after this, that what can be the 4 obstacles that can get in the way of somebody processing their losses successfully. Can you speak to that? You do in the book.
Yes, I think this is, from my perspective, huge, because I think if it was huge for me, maybe it's huge for other people. As I was doing my journaling, that's when I began to realize, as I've said before, that the losses I had never identified, the loss of my world when I left, and that nobody died, but everybody except me was gone. I was the only one surviving, but there was no way back. So the loss of my world without a death experience was a hidden loss. I had not named that. The loss of my lifestyle. I loved riding my bike around. I loved, going, playing soccer. I loved climbing my trees. I loved harmattan. I loved everything that was a part of my life. And not only did I lose it, but I lost that way of living. And so in Chicago, the trees couldn't be climbed. They were big oak trees. They had no branches that you could find. And I just missed it, So, but of course, that seems sort of silly. So, how could you say that was significant? And you lose the relationships, not just, like your grandma and your people that you would think of, but the people who sell the oranges on the street that you always know, and you go by them every day. And you lose these relationships, and when you get back, and you lose the relationships with people who knew you. And when you come to the new place, this is part of the whole identity thing. Nobody knows you. They don't know what you're good at. They don't know what you're bad at.
They don't know your story. Yeah.
They don't know your story. And so all those parts of relationships, how do you reestablish them? And even your parents, when you make that move, don't have the same relationship to the community that you used to have, that they used to have. My dad was the principal. He was a teacher, so I'm the principal's daughter. You get back to Chicago, he's just there, And so you lose that part of your identity, who I am. And of course, for some people who come from places with different languages, how do you even look at your parents who can't fit into the next place at all, and they don't know it either? So it's very complicated, all these things that we haven't lost. But then when I think, why wasn't it resolved? First off, I didn't know. So I say the lack of awareness. I had no idea. There's also a lack of permission, both from yourself, like, okay, well, this is not a big deal. I should get over this. But other people saying, stop crying, whatever these other things. People can say it overtly, but they can also say it like, well, the reason we did it, and you understand the reason. Okay, so I shouldn't mind. I shouldn't feel bad. So we have a lack of permission, and that can come over and over. If you hear people, think about everybody else. They got it way worse than you do. Okay.
Yep, that one.
So that one's a biggie. And it's true. That's the problem. It's the paradox again. You appreciate what you have.
Well, Ruth, I don't, just to interrupt, I don't know if it is true. I always say, okay, so you the other person in the bed next to you lost an arm and both legs. And yeah, you just lost an arm. So I guess it's no big deal.
I know. I mean, I
just wanted to say that, though.
I know. Thank you for saying that, because it is true. And that's the point, is you believe it and stuff. But there was one reviewer who wrote about Letters Never Sent, and she said this woman had absolutely no reason to feel the way she did. She had parents who loved her. They gave her a good home. They gave her all this. She needed to be taught to count her blessings instead of looking at the loss. At which point I was going to pull every book back that ever been out there. And, it goes back to I'm so stupid, I'm so this, I'm so that. But so that was lack of permission, may I say. Then there's lack of time. We take an airplane ride and suddenly we're at the next place. When I was a child, we took ships, and that gave my parents more time. But that becomes, you don't have time to process, and grief takes time to process. But then also what I said before about the lack of comfort, once I saw that, people encouraged me to death. If I was at boarding school, I'm crying, oh, we're going to go swimming tomorrow. Well, good, that's nice. And at least you have a mommy. Other people don't have mommies. But, whatever they're trying to encourage you, that's part of lack of permission, actually. But I realized that nobody that I could remember picked me up and said, it's okay to miss your mommy. Little kids who are 6, it's okay for them to miss their mommies. And even, my best friend died when I was at boarding school in my 2nd grade. And I don't remember everybody was sad, but the awareness of that impact on us as fellow students, was kind of lost. And you get into the funeral and you get into, remembering all the good, but how do you process that? So I think we wind up with no place to process. And so that's where I think the detachment comes, because you don't know what to do with it. And you have to survive it and you have to live. So just leave it over here. But then it comes out in all the ways it does for us as adults, which is pretty nasty sometimes.
It certainly does. And thank you for highlighting that, because we did want to talk about the difference between encouragement and comfort, because you've written that if encouraged before being comforted, the pain is essentially discounted. The same way we don't allow ourselves to feel that pain, we want to protect the inner child when at some point in our lives, and perhaps in our 30s, we realize the inner child doesn't require protection. The inner child requires safety, security, and the need to feel seen, heard, and understood. So comfort really acknowledges the loss, right? And that's kind of the sweet spot. That's what we're looking at when we want to process loss healthily. It acknowledges it. It shares the grief.
Absolutely. And then you can decide what to do with it. And that's the encouragement, okay, so what do I do now? But if you can't even go there, all you can do is take these other behaviors that I've seen. I call it the TCK wall, where you tap and you can't get in because the wall is so thick and you are not going to get in. And those are the people that threw my book, I think, across the room, and said, this is a bunch of garbage. And a lot of parents also didn't want to acknowledge it.
And those are the people who are going to hate our podcast, unfortunately.
Because Doc Doug has said, the people who react that way are the ones who say, don't feel that way because I'm not ready to feel those big feelings, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think that was part of my high school, college thing. I avoided anybody who was just coming back from Africa or something, because I didn't want to be like them. I had worked so hard not to be them. But there is encouragement. It's not that you sit around forever and cry the rest of your life. But when you've finished your crying and when you finished your process, then I think, we do need to encourage each other, and we can encourage ourselves. But we have to comfort first It's
paradox right there. It's a dialectic again. And when you said, it's Bowlby's model also. This is attachment theory at work. First, you need a safe haven that you can turn to, and that's where you get your comfort. And when a child or a person, because we maintain these needs throughout our life, right, feels supported enough, then they dare, and they can be encouraged to dare to go on out there, go back out there at the playground and see if you can try again, or, just apply for the job or go for it and tell your boss what you think, right? But you need the comforting first, and then that comes. And I wanted to say also, lest anybody think that you never be challenging with a child, like you also need to think about the good things and the positive things. Some kids you can swing too far. It is a both and thing. Some kids do need to be challenged, and we all need to be challenged, but we certainly don't need to be pampered, that it's only comfort without expectations. I want to emphasize that person you imitated who says, this girl should be grateful. That's really, really like a harsh way of saying something that is also true, that it's important also to be thankful, grateful, appreciative of what you do have. What are you going to do with the opportunities that you do have? So it's just so hard to stay, and so important to stay in the middle zone in this polarizing world that we live in. And so I really want to keep your message complex and not let it get simplified that Ruth Van Reken just said, you always just need to listen and listen and listen. It's both.
And thank you for saying that again, because like I said, the reason those things would hit me is like when she writes that, then I think, well, she's right. I had all that. So then that takes me back to that message of my childhood. If you had all that, what's your problem?
Well,
and
she's also using the toughest feeling that there is in the world, which is shame. And all kids have experienced shame. It's one thing to have a lack of permission to grieve. It's way worse if it's enforced with shame, shaming. Mm-hmm. And she did that to you because that's probably what was done unto her and what she does with her own vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the word shame was a really important one somewhere. I always learn the most when I do things and people tell me things and correct me or whatever. And I was saying that I felt guilty because I didn't keep all the rules. I really tried hard to keep the rules, and I felt guilty if I didn't. And this person said, that's not guilt. And I said, what is that? He said, that's shame. And I said, what's the difference? And he said, guilt is when you actually, commit a moral transgression, when you do something, and maybe there's a healthy shame, but you need forgiveness for that. He said, shame is for who you are. And, all the I shoulds and I shouldn't. And he said, there's always a lie in that kind of shame, because who said you should or you shouldn't? And he said, for that, you need grace, even for yourself. And that has certainly been another challenge in my life, is all the I shouldn't messages, probably for everybody. But I think we grew up with I grew up, in boarding school. There's a lot of shaming also to keep everybody under control.
Thanks, Ruth. I'm going to see if I can conduct us towards our final movement, right, Nikki? Now is the perfect time.
Thank you so much.
3.
Yes, and I'm excited to explore this further.
And I guess the title of this movement, Ruth, is how you see your transitions work expanding beyond the mobile and cross-cultural community. And of course, much of your career and your global speaking career has been putting this on the map, the importance of understanding the transitions process, what's happening, how we can deal with it.
But or move through it rather than deal with it, I just realized.
Yeah, move through it, thank you. You've also highlighted, and I've certainly joined you in this, that the lessons in all of this are to be applied, can be applied, and are to be applied to all of life's transitions. There's an appropriate emphasis on needing to acknowledge grief and loss before you can move on. That some transitions we can prepare for, and others hit us like a ton of bricks. And I thought it might be interesting as we pan back and expand to invite you to talk to us about your own discovery of that in a personal way, with an example from your own life story, because I know you've had some medical tons of bricks too that have hit you. And I don't know if you'd like to speak to that, but we wanted to invite you to.
I think the bottom line for me, as I look back, is that we start like Fleming did with his Petri dish. He found all of a sudden, he had an accidental discovery about penicillin because he, how come the mold didn't grow in a certain area? And so he looked at that, he studied it, and then he started to expand it. When I think about my life, it's not about saying I'm so special, I'm so different, I'm so whatever. First of all, I'm a human being like everybody else is. And human beings all need relationships. They all have feelings. They all have some desire to be known, to be significant. We all have that. So we start with likeness, and then we look at how did our experience shape us? Well, and also uniqueness. I still have a certain personality and different giftings. And then how did my life shape me? And that's where my TCK part comes in, that I had the mobility and I had this and that and the other thing. So for me, then that created, the loss, and it created the sense of identity issues and all the rest. But that was my experience. That wasn't really my identity per se. And then after that first book, we're writing about TCKs. That's our first little penicillin petri dish. All these people came up to me and they'd say, I share what you're talking about feeling-wise and experience-wise, but I didn't have my details are different. I didn't do it that way. I didn't grow up that way. Why am I feeling like this? Well, I think, okay, and tell me your story. And everybody had a cross-cultural piece. They maybe had parents from two countries. They had been refugees. They had been a minority going to school in a different culture than they went home to. So then the big discussion came, were they TCKs or not? And that started all this argument because, who was, who wasn't, who could be in the club, who couldn't be in the club. I don't like clubs like that because it feels like, that's too small. And I said, did we just create a monster here? That's not the point. And so I tried to think at the same time, if everybody's a TCK, then you have no language left to talk about specific things. So that was kind of a problem. So that was why I created the cross-cultural model, cross-culture kid model, because everybody in that I knew from at least talking to people that we were still talking about identity issues. And people might not have had mobility, but they'd had a cross-cultural experience. And I figured that TCK was one of them. Well, TCKs didn't want to be part of that group, many of them. So they say, are you a TCK or a CCK? And I thought, well, the point was, it's just like if you're a missionary kid, you're also a TCK if you're a military kid, But anyway, we had a little club thing going that, we're more special than them. And I thought, well, we'll just wait and see what happens. But anyway, my mind keeps looking like, why? But why also, well, you can understand the identity part because, again, people, maybe aren't physically mobile, but you go from one grandparent to another and whatever. But my question has been for years, why the grief? And I would look at each thing like international adoption. Maybe they have, whatever, because I always thought of the grief being purely for mobility for us. I mean, that mobility was where the grief came. And I think in doing this last edition, all of a sudden the light went on, like I said, that you could apply the word grief to losing yourself. That when we're making these cross-culture moves, even if it's not mobility, everybody who's in one of these things, even a refugee, okay, they have mobility, but somebody who's going between grandparents, in one grandparent, you can speak one language, the other parent, you can't, that there's something we lose of ourselves. So that's kind of my bigger thing. But then on the bigger thing of transition, the issue of how it applies to life has been huge for me. And a few years, 25 years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that's when I began to understand all of a sudden, like, this is a life transition. You go for your regular mammogram. Life is going on terribly normally. And I know I'm healthy. That year I even went to a mobile clinic because I didn't have time to go down, and all that stuff. And they said, well, they'll send you a letter in a couple of weeks if everything's fine. If it's not fine, they'll call you sooner. So I get home the next day and my answering machine is beeping. Hi, this is St. Margaret's Breast Center. We'd like to talk to you. I thought, this is not good. And so we went down, had some more tests, and, they give you the x-ray, and it wasn't a lump, it's all these things that look like salt. And the guy said, okay, so 25% of people, probably it isn't. And I could tell the way he was talking. I said, when you look at mine, what do you think? He said, at least 50. I thought, that's not good. So then the call comes, and the doctor says, sorry to tell you, you're positive. And that's the change moment. And all of a sudden, everything disappears from before. Life has just gone into a totally different place. So you go into the leave, getting used to it, trying to figure out, how am I going to do? I had a conference in Singapore and Thailand. Do I do those or not? I get the call, and this is the change. And my doctor was nice enough that she had an appointment set with me the next day for the surgeon. And I go in, and And he said, I bet you feel like a horse just kicked you in the face or something. And I said, well, that's probably about what it feels like. But as we were going there, I'm talking to my husband. I said, we're talking about chemo, radiation, all this. I said, we're talking about me. I mean, this is about me. And, it's not about our patients. And so the doctor said, well, you can go to, you can do the trip if you want. It won't matter in terms of the outcome because it's just 2 weeks and, that's not going to affect your prognosis if you can deal with it. And I said, I'll do much better if you let me go because I need time. I need time to get ready for this. And so I went and I talked to different doctors at the conference about, whatever. I did my thing. And then on the airplane home, I thought, okay, now I can face it. And so I had done my saying goodbye. And then, in fact, one of the things, though, that is very important to me is naming hidden losses when I'm going to do something like that. Because I could feel the grief. And I thought, but they've told me probably I'm going to, live. What am I grieving about? And so I spent one whole day in that conference just sitting writing. And I came to the point, the grief was that after all these years of, people being mad at me and all that, the TCK book had just come out. And now we were going to move. And the line of people that was doing it was there. And I was going to have to get out of line. And I had to process, what does it mean to get out of line? And if that space closes and I can never get back in, am I okay? Am I me? And if I have a different line, am I going to be able to live in that? That had been huge for me to process because then in the 2 years that I was doing treatments and I had complications and all that, I could cheer other people on and realize right now that's not my line. I don't know if I'll get back in. And that was huge. And if I spend the rest of my life with a bald head on my driveway, blowing bubbles with my grandkids, am I still me? Am I me because of who I am or what I do? And that was huge for me to be able to try and separate those two. So there's always lessons we can learn. But then the day finally came after I'd had whatever, prednisone and different treatments because I had some lung complications. And I thought, I feel like Ruth again. I thought, oh, what does that mean? And I thought, I'm ready to go back. And I thought, oh, and then I thought, this is entry. I have to get back to life now. How do I get back to being participatory and, engaging and so forth? And then, of course, eventually to involvement. But I have found that model incredibly helpful. When COVID came, the whole world we all went into transit. We went into the middle, messy middle, but we never got to say goodbye. And we had just moved our house to a condo to get ready to be old. So I didn't know neighbors. So anyway, I had to sit down again and do my work and say, what are my hidden losses right now? Another hidden loss for me with cancer was I could never fill out a form and say none of these diseases. And for some reason, that was a pride thing. I'd always been happy. I'd been healthy. So I think that was another thing. And I found in life transitions, when my mother moved in with us, I was feeling grief, even though I wanted her. And I had to do my work about, okay, what are my losses? I don't have the same space I used to have, or I just, have to be responsible. And it's not that I didn't want her. But I have found in my life transitions, the important thing is to sit down and think, what's happening? What am I losing? Because with transitions, we also gain, but we, stop and say, what did we lose? And then we can figure out.
I just think that's really beautiful, Ruth. I've never heard you repeat that mantra like you just did. What are my hidden losses? What a important question for us all to once in a while sit down with a journal and ask ourselves at any important inflection point. And the image of you struggling with having to get out of line really hit me in the gut. And I'm wondering if you can say a bit more of what the line represented for you, what getting out of it, why getting out of it? What can you unpack that image?
Yeah, that's great. Probably the loss of a dream. I had thought I was supposed to be involved with this. I had written, letters had gone out, and there was such mixed reaction that had shocked me. because some people were very angry that I talked about grief, and other people were telling me, why didn't, we all know about this before. So I'd already been through that, and there was a lot of rejection that actually only a couple of years ago did I process what that rejection felt like. Because again, my brain was, understanding. But so now the TCK book had just come out and people were saying things like, oh, I'm so glad you weren't so negative this time. I think, well, okay, we can do that. But the line was, Dave Pollock was at the top. And all of us who had been his proteges were kind of in this line behind him. And it was sort of moving up. And now I was going to have to get out.
So as you're almost at your peak, you're being asked to exit stage left.
Just when the dream is starting and we're taking off, the dream is happening, I'm not going to be part of it. I'm going to miss it. So the line came back to me in a very clear picture when I first found out that Dave Pollock was going to have the tubes removed. He had been in Vienna. He was taken from the school to the hospital, and he had pancreatitis from a gallstone that wasn't taken out before. And the next day he had a cardiac arrest. So he'd been on life support for several days. And it happened that the day that I found this out was Good Friday. And so I was in the Good Friday service feeling very, very sad that Dave was apparently not going to make it. And I had this thought, of I'm going to lose half my brain because we had always been, so together in terms of talking. But when I had that feeling, this verse came and said, if a seed doesn't fall on the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it dies, it bears forth fruit. And the line came back to me, and I saw it. And this time, the line just collapsed. And all these seeds that Dave had sown in all of us went around the world. They just scattered. And it was like, this is too big just for one person. Your job now is to water the seeds and see what you can do to make them grow instead of it all being over. That's your job. And so that was when the line came back, and I guess I was back in it somewhere. But anyway.
But thank you for
that was very
thank you for sharing that. But sorry, Doug, do you want to say something?
No, I just wanted. She said, "Boy, I'm back in," and I wanted to say, "You sure are."
You sure are. You betcha, bottom dollar. And you were speaking this because this is one of the hidden losses that you would journal about, right? Is if where that line when I have to exit, right at the point where I'm really feeling my purpose. Because what a beautiful life to be able to say that your lived experience, the good and the challenging, becomes your life's work and transformative. When that is taken away from you, it's a heavy burden. So I appreciate that you shared that, as that was a part of your thought process and your heart space whilst you were living with this cancer and going through your treatment. And I think it's brilliant that you went through this with the awareness of the transition process because of the work and that of David and everyone before you as you came together, because you've referenced that there is a difference between life transitions and what you call catastrophic transitions, or what Bruce Feiler would call a life quake. And I think a breast cancer diagnosis, which is what you had, is considered catastrophic, and it is a life quake. And so when you journaled about the hidden losses as a result of being aware of that process and guiding yourself through this because you've been there and you've done the work before, that was the internal reflection. But something that we speak about often in our work, especially SPAN, of course, is the importance of support through transition. And I know you talked about as a child, you kept this to yourself. You eventually journaled about it, but you kept this to yourself. You wanted to look almost like that swan who was doing okay on the outside, but not so much in the inside. And so I'm wondering, this time around, through this particular life transition, how did you reach out for support? Did you seek it? Because we're always looking for safe attachments to community, especially in a moment of crisis like that.
Well, I think by that point in life, I had a lot of friends. I certainly didn't hide it. And I have shared, someday I think I should share all my cancer writings. But one of the first ones in terms of what is this disease I have, this word that I have so quickly gotten. Anyway, in the end of that process, make cancer define my disease, but not define me. And to separate what had happened from who I was another important thing. So I could talk about it. I also had to decide how I talked about it because, as far as they knew, they had it. And so I didn't want to say I have cancer, but on the other hand, I don't want to deny it. So I would say I was diagnosed with cancer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I could share it. And of course, in the old days, when I was a student nurse, you were not allowed to ever tell anyone they had cancer. And that was what Kubler-Ross really changed, that she gave permission for people to talk about it. And so by now, it wasn't like a secret. It wasn't my horrible secret. It was a disease I had, or I had an experience I had. And so I had wonderful doctors. I had wonderful, support system there. But I have a family that's incredibly supportive. My friends from high school drove down from Chicago to spend, a day with me. And I had nothing but support. I had flowers, galore. And so that really, really, really was helpful to know that even though I was in a different place, I felt like I'd withdrawn from life for that while. Not withdrawn from it, but that I was, the world was going on without me right now, that I was not forgotten. And that was huge for me. And of course, I could still do other things that you could do by mail or by phone with some of the TCK stuff. But support was, without doubt, very strong for me during that time. And it was important.
And you sought it out. You looked for it this time around.
Yeah, and I received it. Sometimes I think it's hard to receive if you've been a detached person.
To let it in.
You feel like you shouldn't need it, huh?
Yeah.
To let anybody in. That's the hard part.
To let the nutrients in. I referred to you for a couple of years as the mother tree. And there's, of course, Suzanne Simard's work. She was the first one to track how the large trees in the forest send nutrients literally through the mycorrhizal network to the littler trees and nurture ones, even that are sick, that get some extra love and care. It's beautiful to hear also about the mother tree receiving nutrients from the community that kept you upright. And I certainly know I've needed that and needed that very recently. And was fortunate to get a lot of nutrients too. So thank you for sharing that, Ruth.
I'll say one more thing. Old age is its own transition.
You're thriving in your 80s, Ruth.
I know, but I'm recognizing that it's another place now that I wasn't expecting to have the process. But, as you see all these people doing what you used to do and doing it if I say in better, I mean, the whole point is for it all to grow. And it's wonderful to see it growing. It's absolutely wonderful. But there's a relinquishment as well, that I had my turn and now I can cheer other people on. And to make that transition from who I was in that way to who I am more as the cheerleader and not the one who's going to the schools and not the one who's doing things is another transition. It's not all bad. It isn't that. But I'm just aware that I still have to stop, even at 80, almost 81, and say, life is a series of transitions all the way to the end. And watching my children and my grandkids, and, they used to need me to play Chinese checkers with them or something when I would go. And now, hi, Grandma. I go like, hi.
Well, Ruth,
they're out the door.
I know without even asking Nikki that I have her support in saying the following. We're often, as we get started in our podcast, thinking about future episodes. And successful podcasts are around long enough that they can invite people back for another episode. And you just talked about the transition to old age. I wonder if you'd be willing to be a future guest for that episode.
Sure, I just have to figure it out by then, but you'll give me a little time to figure it out.
Given me also permission to ask, because you can't exactly go up to just anybody and say, hey, I was thinking about you for the transition to old age, but you just invited us.
Thanks for the in, Ruth. But
No,
you've actually gotten us thinking, and this is definitely something we wanted to almost close with. I think we may have one more question after this but you've talked about the seedlings that were scattered around the world and how you cannot do this alone, and you have been so active. One of the things I've really loved about you is your willingness and your curiosity to always show up where you can. I mean, there's every single online forum, whether it be the international school community, whether it's SPAN, you're there. You're up with your makeup at 8 a.m. your time, so you could speak to Doug and I 2 p.m. Central Eastern European time. You show up. This is so important to you. And so my question to you is, how would you like to see your work carried further from 2026 and beyond, knowing that slowly you may be passing the baton, so to speak, at this time in your life?
I think what I am enjoying right now, first, I'm enjoying enormously being old enough to see how life works out for other people. I know when I met Doug, I guess I was going to say before, when you never know when you're meeting these different people if you're living fully, and who will be the long-term relationships and who will just be the end of the conference and you'll never see again. But certainly when I met Doug was when he was working on beginning transitions in his school in Ash, American School of The Hague. And he had this program, which was just wonderful. And we had he had 10 people on the panel, and we were asking them questions. Anyway, I won't go into the whole thing because we don't have time, but it was probably one of my more profound conferences I ever saw. And so Doug and I got connected, and I would hear him dream about transitions in schools. And like I said, with the little napkin and drawing the pictures.
I think Doug has the napkin. Look at Doug. He's so cheeky. He told me yesterday he needs to dig this up. And he looks like an organized man. So if you ask for a napkin from 20 years ago, he will have it stored and filed somewhere. And as you can see...
You're giving me too much credit, Nikki, but there are certain things that are transformational. And indeed... and I have it somewhere, and I meant to actually dig it up, but I kept that napkin from Breakfast with Ruth Van Reken going all the way back to, when would that have been? Maybe 2005.
20 years.
Yeah.
At least 20 years,
At least 20 years. Because it was at a nautically themed restaurant, and you wrote on my napkin, "Nobody can tell your story for you." And I kept that, and it has proven to be true. And interestingly, I just also want to point out that the head of school at the, I believe, American International School of Vienna that went to visit David at the hospital would become my future superintendent, and that was Rick Spradling, who would come to the American School of The Hague and be quite instrumental in supporting the work that at first they put up with me doing, and then they could see there was real merit here. And so he writes the afterword to my book, to Safe Passage, and reflects on how those seeds connected. And so it's interesting just to tie that whole story together and see us all connected in a rather beautiful way. And I guess people just have to trust me that the napkin's in my desk.
Yes, we believe you. We believe you.
But I saw Nikki first on a conference, and I just was so impressed. And it's just been so much fun to have the longer term, connection. And so I'm watching the seeds grow, and that gives me great joy. But I also recognized that my job was to sort of open windows. But so much of this applies to more grounded theory, and like seeing Doug work it out with attachment, other people saying, like ISCA. I met the people that started International School Counselors, in China, and they came to something and they said something needs to happen. And all of a sudden, 3 years later, they've made a conference. And so I am so aware I can't do all the things there are to do. This thing is huge. It's big. It's got so many tentacles. And I love watching people who came with an idea turn it into something. And that's what I believe so much. This has been a grassroots, bottom-up thing. And because the people at the top didn't believe it at the beginning. But now it's become whatever it is. And yet we barely started. And the other thing that I'm very curious about and making sure is how much more complicated the story has gotten. And with all the languages around the world, it's not just Westerners going to, someplace like 75 years ago when she first studied people, but it's the impact of language and when parents are in one culture and the kids going to school in another culture, and all the permutations of this are actually astronomical. There's a lot still to go.
So that brings us nicely, I think, to something that Nikki and I wanted to pose first to you, because impactful podcasts, in my opinion, have traditions and often kind of end in a certain way. And this is the first time we're ever launching this question, but we can't think of who better to pose it for the first time to. So here's the closing Safe Passage podcast question for you, Ruth. Can we do that?
Sure. I don't know if I have an answer, but you can ask me.
Curious what you'll say
I could try.
After all of the life transitions you've worked through in your life, what do you wish you had understood better before?
I wish I had understood that I wasn't crazy, that it wasn't just something wrong with me. Because even now, if I go through a transition, you can feel disoriented and lost. But at least I can say now, I'm in the middle. And in a month or 2 or 3, I'll know something, and I can plot it out better. When I was doing many of these at the beginning, I just thought it was all my problems. It was all my fault. And I guess the thing that keeps me so passionate about this is when I just say to people, you can be all of the above. Given your experience, there's a normal process you go through. It's okay. It's called transition. Yes, you have the change, but you will go through transition. And even though you lose, you will also gain, and just be patient. I wish I had known that, because I think for so many people, they wind up feeling like something is permanently wrong with them because they can't figure it out or they feel sad. And they live in that reality of themselves when they don't need to. And at that point, they miss the gifts. And we have so many gifts to use. The gift of joy, of seeing so many places and people. I mean, it's a rich, rich life. But if you're stuck in a corner in depression, you don't get to do it. So that's what I wish I had known, that life was normal, especially when I was a teenager, and thought, what's the matter with me? That there were other teenagers around the world who also were pretending.
Which is why
and that's why
Which is why I think it's so great that your work and that of others have really given language to this experience, because since transition is an internal journey, of course we feel, if we're not aware, of course we feel that we're the only ones. We feel that we're alone because no one can see it. It's lived inside, changes the external event. So the fact that by going through this on your own at first, and then reaching out to others and doing the work, creating the frameworks and the language, and then living it later on in life, knowing, okay, transitions are going to hit me no matter what, and you're going to have to feel them. But to be able to have that conversation, I think, is how we know we're not alone. And that's what we're doing here on Safe Passage. Right, Doc Doug?
That's right. That's right. And Ruth, you want to say something?
I was just going to say you've done a great job. I've been very, very impressed with, first all the span nests and everything and conferences up to this. But I love what you guys are doing. And I look forward to hearing lots more stories. And thank you for asking me about the invisible parts of me that most people, when they look at me, they don't think about my African self. And that part's still a part I treasure. I treasure the gifts of my background. I treasure the relationships I have with people all over the world. And I couldn't have asked for a richer life than I've had. And even the challenges have become part of the richness because they've expanded my awareness of other people who don't even live my experience, but are still people and still suffer loss and transition and the paradox of joy and pain.
Well, you're a model, Ruth Van Reken, of how to live a life well. And I want to thank you personally for being at first I was a famous person I met and then started to feel like a mentor and then started to feel and be a friend. And it's just been a joy growing up next to your wisdom. And I want to tell you something that I only realized, I think, over the course of this podcast, but that you've taught me important things as a clinician too. I didn't realize that you taught me to do what, in fact, I do, or at least I seek to do with my clients, and what I believe we as therapists need to do, and that's to stay with people through the hard patches. All we really need is somebody to stay. And you bravely, in a certain sense, in some ways, just did that for that little girl in you, not fearing the process of exploring those deeper places wherever it was going to take you. Incredibly courageous, inspiring, transformational for many, and for me as a person and as a professional. So I wanted to thank you for that and for helping to shape mine and so many people's lives and careers.
And I'm going to second that motion, Ruth, because your book and your story and your willingness to share that gave me permission at age 36 to say, it's okay. You can do this. It's okay to explore the parts of yourself that are challenging and that have eluded you for so long. It will not be easy, but there is a way through it. And that way is through support. So thank you, Ruth. We're so, so grateful to you.
And thank you both, because you're just spreading the seeds farther. And that's the other joy, is that each one of us has our own little place, and that it's where the seeds are shed, but then they grow, and that's what's happening in the world. And it gives me great joy. Even if I'm a little jealous that I'm not going to see all that happens, but I'm so grateful I've gotten to see this much. Thank you, guys. You're doing a great job.
And thus spoke the mother tree. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for joining us for this edition of the Safe Passage podcast.